we look at Joseph Smith head on and see the things he did in polygamy, that we recognize many of them as being wrong and being dishonest, and still somehow also recognize that as flawed as he was still a prophet of God, still a tool in the hands of God to restore the gospel. Is it possible to reconcile those two images?
And now going to the next topic, and this one is very strong in Mexico and around these areas, and it's polygamy. I remember that just a few weeks ago, I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw that someone shared a meme, and it's one of those almost satire memes, and it's just an enlarged head of Joseph talking to a cartoon of a 19th century woman. It says, trust me, the angel said he was going to kill me if I didn't marry you. So it's sort of this sarcastic approach at Joseph and all that went on. So could you tell us a little bit more about what's on the letter and what's in your reply on this topic?
Yeah, sure. So I'm trying to remember what's in the letter specifically, because people get upset about polygamy for a number of different reasons, and I don't blame them. Polygamy is deeply problematic in a lot of ways. It's very messy. Joseph Smith was not entirely honest when he spoke about polygamy publicly. I mean, he gave these kind of what Richard Bushman calls carefully worded answers when people asked them about polygamy that were in some way technically true, but were very misleading and were intentionally misleading. He'd say, what a thing to say I have 7 wives when I can only find one. Okay, well, that's not really a denial that you're practicing polygamy, Joseph. You only have one legal wife. I mean, he leaned into language that's true. Emma was his only legal wife. But he would make these kinds of statements publicly that were not consistent with what he was actually doing. And I think I have a friend who essentially left the church, largely because he was so distraught by how Joseph handled polygamy with Emma. Joseph did not tell Emma about many of the women he married. And there was even one instance where Emma went back and forth as to whether she was willing to accept polygamy. And at one point she decided, okay, I will accept polygamy on the condition that I get to choose your next wives, and your wives that I choose are the Partridge sisters. Problem was, 2 weeks earlier, Joseph had already married the Partridge sisters. So instead of come clean to Emma, he stages a second wedding where he marries the Partridge sisters again for Emma's benefit. These are things that are really troubling. I mean, there's no way around it. There's no way to sugarcoat it. And it comes as a very difficult thing for members of the church to discover that the founder of the church, the president of the church, is capable of not being honest, can make mistakes and can make serious mistakes like that. I mean, I think lying to your wife about taking other wives is a very serious mistake. I think you'd be excommunicated today if you were to do something like that. You'd just be excommunicated for taking other wives, whether your wife liked it or not. So I am sympathetic to those who find polygamy so troubling that they can't find their way to stay in the church. One of the people who did that was a man named Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery largely left the church over polygamy, over Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger, which Oliver Cowdery, which the church now talks about Fanny Alger as Joseph Smith's first polygamous wife. But Oliver Cowdery insisted it was a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. It wasn't a marriage. Historians have gone back and forth to determine whether it was in a marriage or just an affair. And I think the preponderance of historical evidence would suggest that, yes, it is a marriage. And we can get into that if you want to, if that's helpful to anybody. But anyway, that was enough to drive Oliver out of the church. And Oliver, as you recall, is somebody who saw heavenly visitations. John the Baptist came to restore the Aaronic priesthood, and Oliver Cowdery was there. Peter, James, and John came to restore the Melchizedek priesthood. Oliver Cowdery was there. Jesus came to the Kirtland Temple to accept the Kirtland Temple, and Oliver Cowdery was there and saw that happen. So polygamy was the straw that broke his back, even after all of these miraculous witnesses. But Oliver Cowdery eventually returned to the church. And even when he was out of the church, refused to repudiate his testimony of the Book of Mormon, even as Joseph Smith was saying all kinds of nasty things about Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery, the core of his testimony, wasn't destroyed by polygamy. And he was willing to come back to the church and was willing to come west with the saints, but unfortunately passed away before he could do that. So I see in Oliver Cowdery a template that a lot of members can see. Can we look at Joseph Smith head on and see the things he did in polygamy that we recognize many of them as being wrong and being dishonest, and still somehow also recognize that as flawed as he was still a prophet of God, still a tool in the hands of God to restore the gospel? Is it possible to reconcile those two images? It was for Oliver Cowdery. It is for me. It is not for many members of the church, or many now former members of the church. So that's sort of the broad overview of the most problematic parts of it. I think when you dive into polygamy and you look more closely at it, the caricatures become a lot harder to sustain. Most of the people who criticize Joseph on polygamy assume that Joseph was mad with power and lust and was using his position to bed women right and left, even to bed children. They complain about his one wife who was 14 years old. The church tiptoed around that in its essay on polygamy and said she was just a few months shy of her 15th birthday. It's like, yeah, well, that means she's 14. I mean, don't sugarcoat this.
Yeah,
Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old girl.
like that makes it any better.
Yeah. Like, yeah, the few months, those few months make all the difference. But if you look more closely at what was happening in polygamy, I mean, let's start with the 14-year-old girl. Her father, Heber C. Kimball, was an apostle and approached Joseph about the idea of, I would really like you to be sealed to my daughter in order to link our families together, to bind our families together in the eternities. And the way to do that would be to have you sealed to Helen Mar Kimball. And Joseph agreed to do that. And all of the evidence, particularly firsthand evidence from Helen Mar Kimball herself, is that this was a sealing, not a marriage. In other words, it was, in the language of the time, for eternity only. That was the title of a poem that Helen Mar Kimball wrote, talking about her experience in polygamy. And it's actually a heartbreaking poem because she says, I was told this was going to be for eternity only, that this wouldn't have an impact on my life. But it's having a terrible impact on my life because no other boys want to dance with me at dances, and no other boys are willing to date me. And I'm isolated, and I'm tied to this man I barely know, and who's so much older than me. I mean, it's heartbreaking. It's not at all a pretty picture of polygamy. It is, however, an exoneration of Joseph Smith being a pedophile, because they clearly didn't have a sexual relationship. When polygamy was being explored after Joseph Smith's death in the Temple Lot trials, and they had women come and testify, they didn't call on Helen Mar Kimball to testify because they recognized that she didn't have a sort of husband and wife relationship in the way that we understand it now. So, so when you start looking at it and you say, well, okay, so how many of these relationships are sexual relationships? And you discover that some of them are, but I think the overwhelming majority of them were not. And Joseph Smith was not only sealed to this 14-year-old girl, he was sealed to 60, 70-year-old widows. The average age of Joseph Smith's plural wives was, I did the math at one point, I went through, and it was in the late 30s. It was older than Joseph Smith was at the time of his death. I think it's 38, it might have been 39. But you then start to say, well, why is he doing this? I mean, this is, if Joseph's goal was sexual conquest, there were a whole lot easier ways to go about it, as demonstrated by a guy named John C. Bennett, to whom I am not related. But John C. Bennett was the assistant president of the church, and he introduced an idea called spiritual wifery, where he would go to women and say, we can sleep together because you are now my spiritual wife. A ceremony, we don't have to have anything. We are just spiritually connected, and the way we can do that is by sleeping together. And so he had sex with all kinds of women in Nauvoo with that kind of statement. And Joseph Smith was furious about it and excommunicated him for it. And many of Joseph's denials of polygamy, that people say, oh, he's not being honest in his denial of polygamy, were categorical denials of spiritual wifery, which in Joseph's mind, and I think in the historical record, were very, very different things. Joseph was not going to women and saying, we are now spiritually married, we don't need to have a ceremony. We don't need to be married. He was going to women and saying, we should be married, but this doesn't mean that we're going to live together or even that we're going to have sexual relations. You get a wedding ceremony with me, we're going to be sealed for all of eternity, and you can go back and live with the husband you're married to now. That's one of the big criticisms, is that Joseph is sealed to a number of women who already had husbands. And they said, oh, geez, this is polyandry. This is against the Revelation. Section 132 strictly forbids that. And as you look more closely at that, it becomes clear that the evidence we have for any sexual relationship in those kind of polyandry sealings is virtually non-existent. And the evidence we have that those were sealings and not marriages is in some of the cases very strong. There's one guy who consented to have Joseph Smith sealed to his wife. I can't remember his name now as I'm looking at it. His point was, I don't believe in a next life, and so whatever she wants to do in the next life is up to her. And so he knew about the sealing, he knew about all of this, and this woman went back and lived with him as husband and wife and had sexual relationships with her legal husband, knowing that she was sealed to Joseph Smith in the next life. So that then again sort of diminishes the story of Joseph, the wild-eyed sexual predator. Joseph very clearly, in my mind, saw polygamy as a necessary spiritual practice. He saw it as a restoration of an ancient practice, and that this was something that had to be part of the restoration of all things, that had been foretold. And so that gives me the ability to look at him more charitably than I would if I were looking at him thinking that his intent was to bed as many women as he possibly could. So that's kind of my response, is that in order to understand polygamy and to appreciate polygamy, appreciate is the wrong word, because I don't appreciate polygamy. I think polygamy is kind of a mess. I think from my perspective, Joseph was restoring a beautiful sealing power. The idea of binding the entire human family through temple ordinances into one giant family is one of the most beautiful and powerful revelations that I think Joseph received. But I think that Joseph, to some degree, misinterpreted that to think that the only way to do that, to have those kinds of bindings, is to marry everybody. It wasn't until after Joseph died that we started sealing children to their parents. No children were sealed to parents by Joseph Smith or in Joseph Smith's lifetime. So I think that after Joseph died, we started to get a better understanding of what that sealing power meant, how that sealing power was valuable, and how to do that in a way that doesn't require the kind of heartache and sacrifice that polygamy required. And when you look at how everyone practiced polygamy, not just Joseph, what you see is a story of sacrifice. This is not a sexually licentious community. This required tremendous sacrifice. It was tremendously painful for men and women alike. I think much more painful for women. I don't want to sugarcoat that, but the idea that this was a blissful kind of experience for a lot of the men that did it, I don't think the historical record bears that up at all. So I think we need to honor the faith of the people who believe this to be a religious principle. And I think the people who believe this to be a religious principle included Joseph Smith. And the fact that Joseph Smith in some ways botched the introduction of it, his own practice of it, it isn't surprising to me. How do you do this? You get instructions that you're supposed to do this. What do you do? How do you do it in a way that's not going to upset your wife, your children, your community? I think Joseph was in a terrible predicament. And, so I don't, again, that's a long, messy answer to your question. I don't remember specifically what Jeremy Runnels was complaining about in polygamy, but as I've discussed polygamy since this, those seem to be the central issues that keep coming up.
And nowadays, something that I've heard that has come up when we talk about polygamy is the fact that maybe when we renounced polygamy, a century ago, in some ways we still practice it, and they talk about men whose wife dies and then seals to another woman, and if we take that into the doctrine into account, that basically means that he sealed to two women. No? So that's pretty much polygamy. Or when we think in the afterlife, all the women like Helen Mar Kimball, who were sealed for eternity only, then do we believe that Joseph would have all of them in the afterlife? What do you think about the idea that there's polygamy now in the church? I think that when people ask, well, if I married a man whose wife died, then who's going to be the wife in the afterlife? And that can make people go, well, that's the exact same argument that was presented to Jesus. And he said that in the afterlife, there wouldn't be any marriages. So what's your take on that?
I have a fun story about that Jesus quote. from my mission president, but it's a tangent. I don't know that I'll dive into it. If remind me to tell it to you if you still want it, if you want to hear it. So I want to answer your main question. There's a book out there called The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy, a heartbreaking book written by Carolyn Pearson, where she talks about the fact that we haven't renounced polygamy doctrinally, and that we do continue to allow men to be sealed to multiple women. We don't allow women to be sealed to multiple men, at least not in their lifetime. Now, if a woman was married to multiple men, we're willing to seal her to both or all of the men to whom she was married, but only after she's dead, and maybe even a year or something after she's dead. I don't know the exact point, but men, yes, men can continue to be sealed to women, and so it becomes a sort of serial polygamy, right? Yeah, I mean, you're not allowed to be married to more than one woman at the same time, but you can be married to more than one woman, one after another. And the idea is that eventually in the eternities, you'll be married to both of them or all of them. This is the case with two members of our first presidency. Both President Nelson and President Oaks are sealed to two women. Their first wives died. They remarried. They've been sealed to their second wives. And so, to some degree, they're eternal polygamists, according to our doctrine and our understanding. When I got married, I had conversations with my wife. She can't stand polygamy. And she said, this was a mistake. Polygamy was just a mistake. And I can just accept that. And I don't think there will be any polygamous marriages in the future, in the heavens. I just don't think there will be polygamous marriages. And at the time, that really shook me up. I'm marrying a heretic, right? You have to believe this. You have to believe this. And the older I've gotten, the more I've looked at it, the more I think my wife, as usual, is a lot wiser than I am. We don't have any idea how polygamy is going to work in the next life. We really don't. And it's we should stop saying that we do. President Oaks gave a talk where he began this, and this was just, 3 or 4 years ago. This was fairly recently. And he began by talking about a letter that he had received from a woman who was concerned because she'd married her husband after his first wife had died, and they were both sealed. And was she going to be forced to live in the same house with this other wife in the next life? And the way President Oaks presented the story, it was lighthearted. It was a joke. I was in the conference center at the time singing with the choir, and everybody in the audience laughed. Ha, 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 ha. Isn't this silly? And that really kind of shook me up a little bit, because this is a very real concern this woman had. And President Oaks's response was only trust the Lord. Just trust the Lord. In other words, I don't know. And he doesn't. We don't know. We don't know how polygamy is going to work in the next life. The one thing that I'm willing to hang my hat on is the fact that nobody is going to be forced to be sealed to somebody they don't want to be sealed to. I don't think if somebody doesn't want to be in a polygamous relationship, that they will be forced to be in a polygamous relationship. I hear all these horror stories, for instance, of people. It's very hard sometimes for women to get cancellations of sealings. You know, when you are sealed to somebody and you get a divorce, legal divorce, the sealing is not dissolved. And so if you want to get remarried, if women want to get remarried, and this shows again that we're still operating under these sort of polygamy principles. But if women want to get remarried, they have to get a cancellation of sealing if they want to get resealed. And a lot of these women say, I want to get canceled because I don't want to be stuck with this terrible ex-husband of mine in the next life. Well, I don't think you will be stuck with anybody. I don't think anybody's going to be stuck with anybody in the next life. I trust the Lord enough to do that. But I also recognize that our unwillingness to sort of confront polygamy head on and answer these thorny questions means that there are a lot of unanswered questions that are causing a lot of what I think is unnecessary pain. I think it would be much more helpful if we were to say, okay, we are not going to seal multiple people to anybody in the next life now. If the Lord wants you to be polygamists, and we all want to be polygamists in the next life, let's worry about it then. But now let's get rid of that ghost of eternal polygamy and officially renounce polygamy and plural marriage until the Lord sees, until or if the Lord sees fit to tell us otherwise.
Thank you for sharing that. And just out of curiosity, what's the story with your mission president?
Oh, good. Okay. So my mission president was a guy named Joseph Fielding McConkie. He was Bruce R. McConkie's son. He was Joseph Fielding Smith's grandson. Loved the scriptures, loved to talk about the scriptures at length, had a really masterful understanding of them, and had a wicked sense of humor. People don't realize, and he says he got it from his father. You know, people look at Bruce R. McConkie as this very stern and authoritarian guy. But according to Joseph, his son, he was a funny guy too. And Joseph was a very funny guy. And one of the things that he liked to do, Joseph, my mission president, was spend a zone conference taking a scripture that critics of the church use to prove the church isn't true, and demonstrate how it actually supports the message of the church. And on this occasion, the scripture he used was the one you talked about, that Jesus was confronted by the Sadducees who were trying to prove to him. You look at the scripture in Luke, and it says the Sadducees, who believed there was no resurrection, confronted Jesus with this scenario where a woman gets married, her husband dies, and gets married again, that husband dies. This goes on through 8 husbands. And the question is, which one is going to be her husband in the resurrection? And President McConkie said, okay, look at the context here. The Sadducees aren't interested in marriage. The Sadducees are interested in proving there's no resurrection. And so they've offered a scenario that they think is going to trap Jesus into making a mistake, into exposing the weakness of his flawed resurrection theory. He says, so once you realize that, you see that Jesus's answer is not meant to be a sweeping declaration of a marriage doctrine. It's meant to be a dismissal of a weak argument. Because Jesus then goes on to say, but does not your God say that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And so he points out, look, you can't trap me with this resurrection trick question. Okay, so his response is, they do, in heaven, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. And he says, you need to focus on the antecedent of the pronoun they. Who is they? He says, the they they're talking about is not everybody. The they is the people that the Sadducees are using in the example. Because the Sadducee example is there was with us, in other words, there was a Sadducee woman who is married to 8 different men in succession. And which one's going to be your husband in the resurrection? And Jesus is essentially saying, well, if they're a Sadducee, she didn't marry any of them expecting a resurrection. So what he was pointing out was that they neither marry. These people that don't believe in a resurrection, if you don't believe in a resurrection, you don't believe in the sealing power, you don't believe in any of that, then you're not going to be married to anybody in the next life. You're going to be like the angels of God in heaven. He's saying that's what the scripture means. And he used a modern example. He says, for example, can you think of any woman who has been married to 8 different husbands? And the example we thought of was Elizabeth Taylor. And he said, is there any question as to who Elizabeth Taylor's husband is going to be in the resurrection? And then he said, and this is a little nasty, and then he said, Elizabeth Taylor's going to be lucky to be resurrected. So I mean, I've thought about that many times, and I chuckled heartily at the time. I now think that was probably a little more snide than it should have been, but I dearly loved that man, and I'm willing to forgive him just about anything. He was a great mission president, just a brilliant scholar, and a very kind and decent fellow.
Gracias a todos por ver esta segunda parte de la entrevista con Jim Bennett. Espérenos pronto para la tercera parte.